Tonight, we pull back a curtain the Vatican has fought for centuries to keep closed. A single painting, locked away in the shadows of the Apostolic Palace, has emerged, not by chance, but through a leak that should never have happened. This isn't just a forgotten work of art. It's a window into a version of history the Church has spent lifetimes erasing. Its brushstrokes carry forbidden symbols, impossible constellations, and figures that should not exist, at least not according to the story we've been told. For generations, popes and cardinals ensured it stayed hidden, moving it through secret chambers, sealing it behind stone, even surviving attempts to destroy it. Why? Because to see it is to question everything, not just the Bible, but the very timeline of human history. Beneath the gold and marble of the Vatican lies an empire of silence, and tonight that silence breaks. So before you dismiss this as rumor or fantasy, ask yourself, what kind of truth needs centuries of darkness to survive? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight, the painting the Vatican never wanted you to see is finally in the light. It began with a single image, grainy, dimly lit, the kind of photograph that looks like it was never meant to be seen. No caption, no source. Just a picture quietly circulating in the dark corners of the internet. The colours were muted but strange, like they had been sleeping for centuries. In the centre of the frame was a painting unlike anything that should exist inside the Vatican. At first glance it looked ancient, yet there was something about it that felt almost too modern, too knowing. Within hours, the image had been deleted from the first sites it appeared on. Links vanished, accounts went silent. The few who managed to save it described the moment they first saw it as unsettling, like staring at something beautiful and dangerous all at once. The Vatican, of course, said nothing. No confirmation. No denial. Just silence, the kind that only makes people more curious. And in that silence, whispers began. Some claimed the painting was locked away for over 400 years in a sealed chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace. Others swore it had been stolen during the Napoleonic Wars and quietly returned in a secret deal decades later. A few went even further, insisting it had never been meant for human eyes at all. No one could agree on its origins, but everyone agreed on one thing: the Vatican had been hiding it. The leaked photograph showed a figure standing in the foreground, cloaked in shadow, wearing garments that looked both regal and alien. The background was filled with symbols no one could place. Not purely Christian, not entirely pagan, but a blend of the two with shapes that hinted at something older. The colours were deep reds and golds that seemed to pulse like living embers. There was a sky painted above the figure, but it was not the sky of Rome. It showed a pattern of stars that astronomers would later recognise from a night sky long gone, one last seen more than 2,000 years ago. Art historians who dared to speak up called it impossible. The pigments alone did not belong to the period suggested by its style. They came from lands that, according to official history, the Vatican had no contact with at the time. Others noticed subtle geometric patterns hidden in the folds of the figure's robe, ratios, and alignments that matched ancient architecture and temple design from civilizations separated by oceans. And then came the most dangerous theory of all, that the painting was not simply art, but a message, a record of something the Vatican did not want the world to remember. The idea spread like wildfire, because the more the Church avoided the subject, the more people began to believe the painting's existence threatened more than just religious tradition. It threatened the official story of history itself. What could be so dangerous about a painting that it would be locked away for centuries? Why guard it with silence instead of pride? And if one image could slip through the cracks of secrecy, how many more pieces of hidden truth were still buried under Vatican stone, waiting for their moment to be seen? Theories began to bloom like cracks in marble the moment the image surfaced. Some said the painting had been hidden to cover a political scandal. a relic of a time when the Vatican was entangled in power plays so deep and dangerous that even centuries later, its ghosts could still shake the church. They imagined a pope commissioning a work so bold it bordered on treason, its imagery hinting at alliances with rulers and kingdoms the Vatican would rather erase from history. Others whispered of secret meetings, signed agreements, and betrayals painted into the background, their meaning clear only to those who lived through it. But there were those who thought the truth was even darker. The painting, they said, was not about politics at all. It was about faith itself. In its imagery lay a challenge to the foundations of Christian teaching, a vision of the divine that did not fit the official story. The figure in the centre was not the Christ seen in Renaissance frescoes, nor the stern patriarchs of medieval art. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to blur the line between man and God, between the mortal world and whatever exists beyond it. If that interpretation was true, then the painting was not just beautiful, it was dangerous. It suggested that the history told in pulpits for 2,000 years was incomplete. There was also a theory so strange it bordered on the impossible, yet it refused to die. Some claimed the painting contained knowledge not of this earth, that the symbols hidden in its folds matched carvings found in ruins thousands of miles away, ruins far older than the church itself. They pointed to the constellation in the painted sky and insisted it was not meant to be viewed from Rome, but from somewhere else entirely, somewhere no human had set foot in recorded history. The suggestion was that the artist had either seen something unimaginable or had been told of it by someone who had. What all these theories had in common was one chilling idea. This was not a painting to be displayed in the Vatican Museum, admired by tourists and scholars. This was a secret, the kind of secret that could not be stolen by war or fire, because it had been hidden in the deepest vaults, guarded not by soldiers, but by silence. If even part of its meaning were true, it could unravel centuries of carefully built narrative. It could call into question not only the Church's version of history, but humanity's place in the universe. And so, the Vatican's silence became its loudest statement. By saying nothing, by refusing to acknowledge the painting's existence, it confirmed the most important detail of all. Whatever the truth may be, it was never meant to be known. The question was not only why it was hidden, but what else might be hidden with it, sealed away in the same darkness, waiting for a moment that might never come. When the first journalists reached out to the Vatican press office, they received nothing but polite deflections, no denial, no confirmation, not even an acknowledgement that the painting existed. The official statements were carefully worded, speaking vaguely about the Church's vast collections and its commitment to preserving art, but never touching the image that had begun to circulate. It was as if the Vatican had built an invisible wall around the subject, a wall made not of stone, but of silence. This silence did not go unnoticed. In fact, it seemed to amplify the painting's mystery. Every day, without comment, made the whispers grow louder. Scholars who had spent decades working in the Vatican archives suddenly found their access restricted. Some were told their research requests were postponed due to administrative review. Others were informed entire sections of the archives were temporarily closed for cataloguing. None of this had been announced to the Christ, public, but those who worked inside the system knew what it meant. The Vatican was tightening its grip. Security around the archives was always strict, but within weeks of the leak, it became something entirely different. Researchers reported new guards stationed at entrance points, additional ID checks, and sudden audits of the materials they were working on. The climate inside shifted from quiet scholarship to something closer to suspicion. People who had worked side by side for years now avoided speaking openly in the reading rooms. Some whispered that every desk had ears, every conversation noted. For centuries, the Vatican had managed to protect secrets by simply letting them fade from sight. If something was buried deep enough, it didn't matter whether the public suspected it existed. Without proof, suspicion was just noise. But this time was different. This time, a single image had escaped, and no matter how many times it was deleted, it kept returning. It had taken root in too many minds. The Church's decision to remain silent was not just about denying the public an answer. Silence was a tool, a strategy perfected over generations. It allowed the Vatican to control the pace of the story, to avoid being cornered into a statement that might later be used against them. It also forced the conversation into speculation, where fact and fiction blurred so completely that the truth could hide comfortably between them. In that space between what was seen and what was known, the painting began to change shape. To some, it was a simple work of art caught in a storm of conspiracy. To others, it was the most important artifact of our time. The Vatican did not need to tell the world what it thought. Its silence told us everything. The more they said nothing, the more people believed there was something to hide. And in the long shadow of that silence, the painting's mystery only grew. The first real investigation into the painting began with a simple question: who painted it? In the Vatican's immense collection, every piece, no matter how obscure, carries a trail of documentation. Names of artists, dates of completion, the identity of patrons, even the exact location where the work was stored. These records are meticulous, spanning centuries, and have allowed scholars to track the journey of some of the world's most famous art. But when researchers began combing through the registries for the leaked painting, they found nothing. No signature, no entry. Not a single note suggesting the artist ever existed. At first, this seemed impossible. The painting's quality made it clear it had not been created by an amateur. The skill in its brushwork, the precision in its geometry, the deliberate choice of pigments, this was the work of a master. Yet it was as though that master had been erased from history. No apprenticeship records, no mentions in letters or journals, no stylistic fingerprints that tied them to any other known work. Some wondered if the artist's name had been deliberately removed. Over the centuries, the Vatican had altered records for political and religious reasons, quietly rewriting details to fit official narratives. Could this be another example? If the painting's imagery challenged the Church's authority, perhaps erasing the artist was the first step in burying the message. Without a name, the work would float in uncertainty, stripped of the context that could reveal its true origin. Others offered a more haunting possibility, that the artist was never meant to be known at all. This theory suggested the work was commissioned in secret, created under conditions where the painter could not claim ownership. There were whispers of Vatican projects carried out in underground studios, where skilled individuals worked under oath and isolation, their creations destined to vanish into private vaults. In such cases, the artist would be as invisible as the art itself. A few experts dared to compare the style to certain forgotten schools of art that bridged European and Middle Eastern techniques. The blend of influences in the painting, the fine shadowing reminiscent of Persian miniatures, the layered symbolism of early Christian mosaics, and the almost mathematical precision of ancient Greek design, suggested an artist who had travelled far, or at least had access to knowledge from across continents. This would have been highly unusual, even suspicious, in the tightly controlled artistic world of the medieval church. Without a name, the painting became an orphan in history, and in some ways, this made it even more dangerous. A work tied to a famous artist could be explained, catalogued, or even dismissed as eccentric genius, but a work with no origin was harder to control. It was a fragment of history unanchored to any known person or place, free to drift and take on meanings the Vatican could never fully contain. Perhaps that is why it was hidden, not just because of what it showed, but because no one could say for certain who had dared to create it. Long before the photograph appeared online, there were already whispers inside the Vatican's own walls. They came from men who had devoted their entire lives to service and prayer, men who had taken vows of silence, yet could not help but let fragments of a story slip through. These were monks who had seen the painting with their own eyes, though never for more than a few minutes, and always under circumstances that made it feel more like a confession than a privilege. One account came from a monk who had served in the archives during the 1970s. He told a trusted friend, in a voice barely above a whisper, that deep within a locked chamber there hung a work of art unlike anything else in the collection. He said it was taller than a man and framed in black wood that looked as old as the walls themselves. The light in the room was dim, but even in that gloom, the colours seemed alive. He described figures that appeared human at first glance, but the longer you looked, the more you noticed their proportions were not quite right. Their eyes seemed to hold more than one colour at once. Their hands had a strange elegance, too elongated for comfort. Another story came from a monk who claimed to have been brought into the hidden gallery to clean the floors. He said the painting's background was not a landscape of earth, but a place that could not be named. The sky was filled with constellations that did not match any star charts he had seen, and the horizon glowed with a light that seemed to come from nowhere. In the foreground, he noticed shapes that were not entirely solid, as if the artist had painted something halfway between matter and light. He said looking at it felt like remembering a dream you had never dreamed. There were also stories of monks who felt physically changed after seeing it. One spoke of feeling dizzy, as though the ground beneath him had tilted. Another claimed the air in the room had a weight to it, like walking into the stillness before a thunderstorm. A few said nothing at all, only crossing themselves quickly when the topic arose, as if speaking about it might invite something unwelcome. What made these whispered sightings so powerful was the consistency. The monks came from different orders, different generations, yet their descriptions carried the same strange details. A world that was not Earth, figures that were not entirely human, a sense of being watched by something inside the painting. None of them could say for certain what it meant, only that it was not meant for the eyes of the public. The Vatican never acknowledged these accounts, and perhaps they did not need to. In a place where silence is often the loudest answer, the absence of denial only made the whispers grow. By the time the image finally surfaced decades later, the painting was no longer just a secret artifact. It was a legend that had been waiting patiently in the dark, remembered only by those who had dared to look upon it. Those who have studied the leaked image closely say the most disturbing thing about it is not the central figure, nor the strange sky above, but the symbols scattered throughout the composition. At first glance, they appear to be harmless decorative elements, the sort of patterns and motifs an artist might use to fill space. But when historians and archaeologists began identifying them, the picture became far more complicated. In the folds of the cloaked figure's robe are tiny engravings that match symbols carved into the walls of Egyptian temples, dating back more than 3,000 years. These are not Christian crosses or familiar biblical imagery, but shapes associated with ancient gods like Osiris and Isis, deities the early church had gone to great lengths to label as pagan and false. The arrangement of these shapes is not random either. They are positioned in a sequence that mirrors inscriptions found on a burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings, a sequence thought to describe the soul's journey through the afterlife. Elsewhere in the painting, near the figure's feet, there is a spiral design almost identical to the ones found at Neolithic sites in Europe, thousands of years before the birth of Christianity. Spirals in these ancient cultures were believed to represent cycles of time, life, and death. A concept the Church did not encourage outside its own theology. That such a symbol would be placed in a sacred image stored in the Vatican is enough to make even seasoned scholars uneasy. Above the figure, just beneath the strange constellation, is another puzzle. Hidden in the background is what appears to be a series of interlocking triangles, forming a shape known in certain pre-Christian traditions as the seal of the ancient sun. This symbol has no place in Catholic iconography. In fact, its origins stretch into mystery schools and esoteric sects that the Church had once actively persecuted. Its inclusion here cannot be explained by accident. Even more curious are the colours themselves. The pigments form patterns that resemble old Mediterranean mosaics, but also echo the designs of artifacts from Mesopotamia, a civilization that predates Rome by thousands of years. Art historians who have risked speaking publicly about this claim, the work may be referencing a unified spiritual language that existed long before any single religion took hold, a language the Vatican would have no interest in promoting. The presence of these symbols poses a dangerous question. If the painting was intended for the Church, why would it incorporate imagery from belief systems that the Church had fought to erase? Was the artist trying to hide a message in plain sight, trusting that only those with the right knowledge would understand it? Or was the painting a record of something older than the Church itself, something the Vatican could not destroy but could at least keep locked away? Whatever the truth, the combination of these symbols tells a story that should not exist according to official history. And perhaps that is why the painting remains hidden, because if the world were to see and recognize them, it might start to wonder what other truths have been quietly erased. When researchers tried to date the painting, they expected to narrow its origin down to a few decades. The Vatican's art registries are famous for their precision, listing not only the year a work was created, but often the exact month it was commissioned and completed. Yet in this case, the trail led to a strange and unsettling void. The style of the painting, its pigments, and the construction of its frame all pointed to a period that should have been easy to place, somewhere between the late 1400s and the early 1500s. But when historians reached that section of the Vatican's records, they found an inexplicable silence. There was no gap in the numbering of the registry volumes, no missing pages or obvious signs of tampering. Instead, the records for that time were simply thin. A century that should have been bursting with artistic commissions was reduced to a handful of minor works, none of which matched the skill or scale of the leaked painting. For 100 years, the artistic heartbeat of the Vatican seemed to have slowed to almost nothing. The more they looked, the stranger it became. This was an era when art across Europe was exploding with innovation. In Florence, Venice, and Milan, painters were transforming religious scenes into vivid, lifelike visions. In the courts of Spain and France, grand commissions were celebrated as symbols of power and piety. Yet the Vatican, supposedly the greatest patron of all, appeared to have been unusually quiet. Officially, there were no missing years, yet it was as if the century had been drained of colour. Some speculated that this absence might be the result of lost records, perhaps destroyed by fire or war. But no such events were recorded, and the Vatican had preserved works and documents through far worse disasters. Others believed this was deliberate, that this silent century was an intentional erasure, a rewriting of history where only the safe and approved works survived. If that were the case, the leaked painting might have belonged to this invisible period, a masterpiece that survived in secret because it could not be shown without raising questions about the entire gap. Art historians began to notice small hints scattered in unrelated documents. Letters from visiting diplomats spoke of seeing extraordinary works in Vatican halls, pieces they described with awe, but which no longer exist in any inventory. A papal diary from the early 1600s mentioned moving certain painted panels into private storage for reflection and safeguarding, with no further explanation. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. The painting's likely creation date fits neatly inside this missing century, a time when the Vatican's artistic output appears to vanish from the public record. If the Church had indeed chosen to lock away works from that period, the reasons could range from political scandal to theological heresy, or perhaps something even more unsettling. And if one painting from that silent 100 years has now slipped into the light, it is almost certain that others still lie hidden, waiting in the shadows for the day history decides to remember them. The mystery of the painting's creation leads to one of the most haunting questions of all. Was the artist a willing participant in its making, or was the masterpiece born from something far darker? In the grand halls of the Renaissance, artists and patrons often worked hand in hand. A pope or cardinal would commission a work outlining its theme and purpose, while the artist brought it to life with skill and vision. These were arrangements built on prestige, faith, and the promise of immortality through art. But nothing about this painting feels like the result of such a harmonious partnership. The absence of the artist's name in any known records suggests more than simple oversight. In most commissions, the Church proudly displayed the names of its chosen creators, turning them into celebrated figures whose loyalty to Rome was rewarded with both fame and fortune. Here, there is only silence, as though the artist's existence had been intentionally erased. Some historians believe this points to a darker truth, that the painting was created under conditions that stripped the artist of any claim to it. There are rare accounts from the archives describing enclosed commissions, secret works, produced in locked studios where the artist lived and worked under constant supervision. In these cases, the creator had no contact with the outside world until the piece was finished, and in some instances, never returned to public life at all. If the leaked painting came from such an arrangement, the artist may not have been a patron's celebrated choice, but a prisoner's quiet labour. The complexity of the imagery adds to this unsettling theory. The painting's mix of forbidden symbols, its blending of religious traditions, and its precise astronomical details suggest the artist had access to knowledge far beyond that of the average craftsman. Such knowledge could have come from personal study, from travels to distant lands, or from exposure to ancient manuscripts hidden deep in the Vatican's vaults. But with that access would have come danger. An artist seen studying certain texts or referencing certain ideas risked accusations of heresy, charges that could destroy a life in an instant. If the Vatican truly wanted a piece like this for reasons of its own, whether as a coded record, a test of loyalty, or a tool for private contemplation, it might have chosen someone with the skill and the knowledge to create it, but kept them under watch to ensure the work never left their control. In this scenario, the artist's anonymity was not an accident, but a prison sentence that extended beyond life, locking their identity away forever. The painting, then, could be more than a work of genius. It could be a silent testimony to a creator who worked in captivity, each brushstroke carrying both the vision of the commissioner and the quiet resistance of the one who painted it. Perhaps that is why it feels so different, so unsettling. It may not only be the subject matter that disturbs us, but the faint, unshakable sense that we are looking at the trapped soul of the person who made it. When art restorers examined the leaked photograph under magnification, what caught their attention first was not the composition, but the colours. Even through the distortion of the image, they could see hues that should not have been possible in the era the painting likely came from. Reds that burned like embers, yet held an almost metallic sheen. Blues so deep they seemed to swallow light. Golds that shimmered in a way no ordinary leaf could match. These were not the colours of the Renaissance palette, and their presence raised more questions than answers. In Renaissance Europe, artists were limited by the pigments available to them. Many were created from minerals or plants found locally, while the rarest had to be imported at great cost. Ultramarine, for example, came from lapis lazuli, mined in what is now Afghanistan, and its use was strictly controlled. But the painting in question contained shades that matched pigments from even more distant lands, places that, according to official history, the Vatican had no contact with at the time. Forensic pigment analysis, performed on a rumoured chip of paint said to have been smuggled out decades earlier, revealed traces of a vibrant green derived from minerals found only in South America. Another section of the work contained a yellow that matched the chemical composition of a pigment traditionally used in parts of Southeast Asia. These findings are impossible to explain if we accept the established timeline of global exploration. The Vatican's own historical records insist that contact with those regions came centuries later, long after the painting's supposed creation date. The simplest explanation would be that the painting was created much later than believed, but the techniques and style argue otherwise. The brushwork and layering belong firmly to a period several hundred years before such pigments should have reached Europe. That leaves two unsettling possibilities. Either the Church had access to global trade routes far earlier than it admits, or the pigments arrived through some entirely different means, one that historians are not prepared to discuss openly. Adding to the mystery is the fact that the colours seem almost unnaturally preserved. Normally, pigments of great age fade over centuries, losing their brightness to light and time. Yet the ones in this painting appear as if they were mixed yesterday. Some scientists who have studied the image suggest the pigments were bound with an unknown medium, one that resists decay. Whatever it is, it does not match any known European formula from the period. If the Vatican truly possesses a painting that contains materials from distant lands long before such contact was possible, it would not just be an art historical anomaly, it would be evidence of a hidden chapter in world history. That alone would be enough to explain why the painting remains buried. It is not only the imagery that could unsettle the faithful, but the undeniable proof hidden in its very colours that the world was far more connected and perhaps far more advanced than we have been taught to believe. At the centre of the painting, dominating the composition yet somehow shrouded in mystery, stands a figure wrapped in heavy, dark robes. The folds are painted with such skill that they seem to drink in the light, creating an effect that makes the figure almost dissolve into the shadows around it. The face is partially hidden beneath a hood, revealing only enough to suggest features both human and strangely unfamiliar. It is not the gentle, open countenance of Christ from Renaissance depictions, nor the stern authority of Moses or the apostles. This is someone, or something, else entirely. What makes the figure even more unsettling is the presence of unmistakable papal insignia. Resting upon the figure's head, half visible under the hood, is the outline of a triple-tiered tiara, the symbol of papal authority used for centuries. Across the chest, faint but discernible, is a golden cross of a style worn by certain popes in the late Middle Ages. And in one hand, hidden in shadow but just catching the light, is a staff topped with a symbol that blends the Christian cross with shapes far older and more arcane. The combination is deeply contradictory. The attire speaks of the highest office in the Catholic Church, yet the posture and presence of the figure carry an air of detachment, almost as if it stands apart from the faith it represents. The hooded head is tilted slightly downward, not in humility, but in observation, as though it is watching something outside the frame, or perhaps watching the viewer themselves. Some art historians believe this was a coded warning. By placing papal symbols on a figure that does not resemble any known pope or saint, the artist could have been questioning the nature of authority, hinting that those who wear the robes of power are not always who they appear to be. Others take it even further, suggesting that the figure may not represent a person at all, but an idea, the embodiment of the Church as a shadowy force, holding secrets behind the trappings of holiness. There are also whispers of something more sinister. The proportions of the figure are subtly off, the arms too long, the shoulders too narrow, the hands too refined. In certain lighting, the face seems to shift, the features almost changing shape depending on where the viewer stands. Some claim this is a deliberate optical illusion, a way for the artist to imply that the figure is not entirely of this world. If the figure truly combines the symbols of the papacy with a form that is neither saintly nor human, it would explain much about the Vatican's desire to keep the painting hidden. Such imagery could be read as blasphemous, heretical, or even prophetic, depending on the interpreter. And perhaps that is the greatest danger of all, not that the figure's meaning is clear, but that it remains open enough for countless interpretations, each more unsettling than the last. The shadows conceal its face, but they cannot conceal the feeling it leaves behind, a presence that lingers long after you have looked away. Above the cloaked figure, stretching across the upper third of the painting, is a sky unlike any that should appear in a work of Vatican art. It is not the soft, symbolic blue seen in so many religious frescoes, dotted with generic stars meant only to suggest the heavens. Instead, it is a meticulously painted night sky, rendered with such precision that modern astronomers could identify each star and its position. And when they did, they discovered something extraordinary. The constellations in the painting do not match the modern night sky over Rome, nor that of the Renaissance when the work was likely created. Instead, they mirror the sky as it would have appeared over 2,000 years ago, long before the founding of the Church, during a very specific and rare astronomical alignment. This event, a convergence of several planets in the constellation Leo, last occurred in the year 252 BC, and it would have been visible only from certain latitudes. The accuracy is unnerving. Every star, every planetary position is painted exactly where it should be for that date. This is not the work of an artist using imagination or poetic license. This is astronomy, captured with the precision of someone who had either witnessed it firsthand or had access to records far older than any known to exist in Europe at the time. For historians, this detail opens an uncomfortable set of possibilities. Either the artist had knowledge of ancient star charts from civilizations that predated Rome, or they had access to observers and scholars whose work had been carefully preserved in secrecy. Such records could have come from Egypt, Mesopotamia, or even earlier, from cultures whose names we no longer remember. If the Vatican holds such materials, it would mean the Church has guarded not only religious documents, but also scientific knowledge, stretching back into prehistory. The choice to include this sky in the painting feels deliberate, even defiant. In Catholic art, the heavens are usually depicted in symbolic terms, meant to evoke divine beauty rather than literal truth. Here, the artist seems to be saying that the true heavens matter, that the exact arrangement of stars and planets tells a story worth recording. The fact that this story predates the Church by centuries suggests it might carry a message the Vatican would prefer to keep to itself. Some have even speculated that the alignment itself had spiritual or prophetic significance, that it marked an event or a visitation long forgotten in public memory, but preserved in the Church's most secret records. If that is true, then the painting is not simply art, but a coded archive, a way to hide dangerous knowledge in plain sight. Whatever its meaning, the inclusion of such an ancient sky changes the nature of the painting entirely. It is no longer just a mysterious image with strange symbols and a shadowed figure. It is a map to a moment in time, a moment the Vatican has carried forward for over 2 millennia, hidden in the folds of a work no one was ever meant to see. At first glance, the painting's background appears to be a blend of shadow and subtle ornamentation, the sort of visual texture that many artists use to frame a central subject without distracting from it. But closer study reveals something far more deliberate. Hidden within the folds of the cloaked figure's robes, in the curve of the horizon, and even in the arrangement of objects on the ground, are geometric shapes that seem to obey a secret set of rules. These are not random flourishes. They are precise, mathematical patterns that match sacred ratios known to ancient mystery schools. The most striking of these is the golden ratio, a proportion found throughout nature and in the architecture of temples from Greece to Egypt. The curve of the staff, held by the central figure, follows this ratio perfectly, as do the distances between certain symbols scattered across the canvas. Even the placement of the figure within the frame adheres to a geometric harmony that feels too intentional to be coincidence. In the upper corners, faint lines, almost invisible to the casual eye, intersect to form shapes resembling the flower of life, a pattern associated with creation myths in multiple ancient cultures. This pattern has been found carved into stone at sites thousands of years old, from the temples of Abydos in Egypt to ruins in the Far East. Its inclusion here is deeply puzzling, especially given the Church's historical stance against pagan symbolism. Other ratios and shapes hint at even more obscure knowledge. The angles between certain elements in the painting match those used in the construction of megalithic monuments like Stonehenge and the temples of Malta. Scholars who have analysed these measurements believe they may encode astronomical or energetic principles, ideas that were central to ancient mystery schools, but which have no place in official Catholic theology. What makes these patterns so intriguing is that they are woven into the painting in such a way that they do not interrupt the surface beauty of the work. To a casual observer, they are invisible. Only by overlaying lines and measurements does the hidden structure reveal itself, like a skeleton beneath the skin. This suggests that the artist not only understood these sacred geometries, but intended them to remain hidden from all but the most observant viewers. If the Vatican knew of these patterns, it might explain why the painting was never displayed. To acknowledge its existence would be to invite questions about how such ancient and supposedly pre-Christian knowledge found its way into a work likely created under church patronage. It would also raise the uncomfortable possibility that the church has long guarded secrets about humanity's past, secrets not only of faith, but of science and geometry, stretching back to a time when the divine and the mathematical were one and the same. In this light, the painting becomes more than art. It becomes a cipher, a language of light and form, designed to speak across centuries, carrying truths that could unsettle everything we think we know about where our knowledge began. Among the more daring voices to speak about the leaked image are scholars who believe it portrays nothing less than an alternate creation story, one that runs parallel to, and in some ways directly contradicts, the account in Genesis. They do not make this claim lightly. It is built on a careful reading of the painting's symbols, figures, and background, each pointing toward a version of humanity's origins that does not align with the biblical narrative the Vatican has upheld for centuries. At the heart of their interpretation is the cloaked figure, not as God, Christ, or any recognized saint, but as a being present before the formation of the world we know. In this reading, the figure is neither entirely divine nor entirely human, but something in between, a mediator, a traveller between realms, bringing knowledge to a young and unformed earth. The landscape beneath its feet is barren yet lit with strange, otherworldly light, as if creation is in the process of happening, but not in the orderly, 7-day sequence of Scripture. Scattered through the scene are smaller figures, half-formed, their features incomplete. Some appear to be reaching upward toward the cloaked being, while others turn away, as if resisting its presence. In the heretical interpretation, these are not Adam and Eve, but the first versions of humanity, prototypes in a process of shaping life that is more experimental than divine decree. The suggestion is that humanity was not spoken into existence in an instant, but crafted over time, possibly with interventions from beings beyond our current understanding. The sky above, with its ancient constellations, plays a crucial role in this theory. The alignment, dating back over 2 millennia before the birth of Christ, could be a marker not of a prophetic future, but of a remembered past, the time when this act of creation occurred. The inclusion of symbols from Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and even prehistoric cultures hints that this event was known to many civilizations long before the Bible's account took center stage. One of the most controversial elements in this reading is the absence of the Garden of Eden imagery, so common in religious art. There is no lush greenery, no forbidden fruit, no serpent. Instead, the ground is marked by geometric patterns and symbols, as if the act of creation was as much a mathematical and energetic process as a spiritual one. This mirrors ideas from ancient mystery schools, where the universe was believed to emerge from patterns and vibrations rather than the will of a single deity. For the Vatican, such an interpretation would be unacceptable, not only because it challenges the theological foundation of human origin, but because it suggests that the Church's creation story is one version among many, and perhaps not the oldest or most accurate. If this painting truly encodes an alternate beginning, it could upend centuries of teaching, forcing believers to reconsider the very nature of God, humanity, and the forces that shaped our world. That alone would be reason enough to keep it locked away in darkness. If the painting's alternate creation story was enough to unsettle scholars, its possible portrayal of Christ is even more provocative. At first glance, most viewers would not immediately identify the central figure as Jesus. There is no halo, no crown of thorns, no familiar white robe. Yet, subtle details suggest that this shadowed, cloaked being may indeed be meant to represent him, but in a form that contradicts nearly every image sanctioned by the Church. In traditional Christian art, Christ is shown as compassionate, radiant, and human in every sense. His eyes invite trust, his posture radiates openness, and his features are drawn to inspire devotion. Here, the figure's face is obscured by shadow, the eyes seemingly deep and knowing but unreadable. The body is covered in heavy, dark robes rather than simple garments, and the hands, long, slender, almost unnaturally refined, hold symbols not found in any gospel account. The staff is topped with a cross, intertwined with geometric shapes tied to pre-Christian traditions, suggesting a blending of belief systems that official doctrine would never allow. The most startling element is the posture. Instead of blessing the viewer or reaching out to heal, the figure stands still, as if waiting, observing, or even judging. There is no warmth in the stance, no invitation, only the sense that this being is present for a purpose that is not immediately benevolent. For some scholars, this is the most troubling part. If this is indeed Christ, he is not portrayed as the loving saviour of the Gospels, but as a more enigmatic, possibly even distant force. There are also small but telling deviations from Scripture. The sandals at the figure's feet are of a style not worn in 1st century Judea, but closer to ceremonial footwear used by high-ranking priests in ancient Egypt. The background shows no traces of the familiar biblical landscapes, no Galilean hills, no Jerusalem skyline. Instead, the horizon features a glowing, alien light and constellations that tie the scene to a time thousands of years before his birth. Some theologians believe the painting might be presenting a version of Jesus as an eternal, pre-existent being, one who walked the earth long before the events of the New Testament. This idea, while hinted at in some mystical traditions, is not part of official Catholic teaching. Depicting him this way collapses the linear narrative of his life, suggesting that he might have appeared to humanity in multiple forms across different ages, a concept that edges dangerously close to heresy in the eyes of the Vatican. For devout believers accustomed to the gospel image of Jesus as teacher, shepherd, and redeemer, this depiction could be deeply unsettling. It challenges not just how he looked, but what his role truly was in humanity's story. If the painting were made public, it could inspire questions the Church has worked for centuries to avoid, questions about the nature of Christ, his true origin, and whether the version preserved in the Gospels is the whole truth or a carefully chosen fragment of a much larger, stranger picture. In most great religious paintings, the presence of familiar biblical figures is as essential as the colours on the canvas. Mary, the apostles, prophets, and angels are standard, each placed in positions of honour to reaffirm the story and teachings of the faith. Yet in this painting, they are nowhere to be found. The absence is not subtle. It feels intentional, as though the artist has cleared the stage of every expected character and replaced them with beings that defy identification. These beings are not angels in the way the Church has taught them. They lack the flowing robes, feathered wings, and serene expressions that fill cathedral ceilings. Instead, their forms are ambiguous, hovering between human and something entirely other. Some are tall and elongated, their limbs impossibly slender. Others are short and compact, their heads slightly larger than proportion would allow, giving them an almost childlike but unsettling appearance. Their skin tones vary wildly, some pale as marble, others dark and shimmering as obsidian, a few seeming to carry a faint inner glow. Positioned around the central cloaked figure, these entities appear to be engaged in a silent dialogue with it, their gestures deliberate but unreadable. One stands with its hands pressed together, not in prayer, but in a pose closer to a formal salute. Another seems to be holding an object shaped like a sphere of light, offering it to the figure in the center. A third turns its gaze toward the viewer, its eyes large and unblinking, as if aware of being observed. The most disquieting detail is that none of these beings correspond to any described in the Bible. There is no Gabriel, no Michael, no Elijah, or John. The deliberate omission of these familiar figures strips the scene of its usual anchor to Christian narrative. Instead, it hints at an entirely different spiritual hierarchy, one in which these unknown beings play central roles. Scholars who have studied the leaked image believe they may represent a pantheon from an older or parallel tradition, perhaps one remembered only in fragments through myths scattered across ancient civilizations. Their clothing offers few clues but adds to the mystery. Some wear draped fabrics decorated with geometric patterns similar to those found in the painting's hidden sacred ratios. Others seem to wear garments made of metallic threads, catching the strange light of the sky above. A few appear almost nude, their bodies marked with symbols rather than clothed in fabric. For viewers raised on the imagery of Christian art, the absence of biblical icons and the introduction of these alien-seeming figures would be profoundly destabilizing. It challenges the idea that the biblical cast of characters is universal and complete, suggesting instead that there are other spiritual actors at work, ones the Church has chosen not to acknowledge. If the Vatican truly believes this painting depicts beings outside its sanctioned doctrine, its secrecy makes sense. Revealing it would invite questions about who these figures are, where they came from, and why their story has been erased from the faith's official record. And once those questions begin, they are not easily silenced. Beneath the grand halls and marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace lies a part of the Vatican few will ever see. It is not part of the public tours, nor is it marked on any official map. Access is granted only to a select handful of archivists, conservators, and high-ranking clergy, each sworn to secrecy. It is here, in a climate-controlled chamber deep underground, that the painting has been kept for what may be centuries. The entrance to this hidden gallery is unremarkable, hidden behind a plain wooden door along an otherwise unassuming hallway. Behind it, however, is a staircase of cool stone that descends far below the palace floor. The air changes as you go down, growing colder and drier, the perfect environment for preserving delicate materials. At the bottom is a small antechamber lined with reinforced doors, each leading to rooms filled with works of art that the public will never be allowed to see. The room where the painting rests is more like a vault than a gallery. The walls are fitted with shelves holding rolled canvases, flat drawers containing centuries-old sketches, and wooden crates whose contents are known only to those with clearance. The lighting is dim and carefully controlled to avoid damaging pigments, and the temperature never wavers by more than a single degree. Every item here is catalogued in a private registry kept under lock and key, separate from the official art inventory of the Vatican museums. The painting itself is stored behind a sheet of protective glass, mounted in a custom frame that both supports its weight and prevents warping. A small sensor monitors the humidity and temperature around it at all times, sending alerts to a control room should even the slightest fluctuation occur. Despite the secrecy, the Vatican clearly spares no effort in preserving it. This is not a forgotten relic left to gather dust. It is an object of value, protected with the same care as the Church's most treasured public masterpieces. Occasionally, a handful of approved experts are granted access to view it. These visits are never documented in public records, and those who are invited rarely speak of the experience afterward. Some have suggested that the painting is shown only to certain individuals as part of an initiation into deeper layers of Vatican knowledge, a rite of passage that leaves them with truths they cannot share. Even the corridors leading to the chamber are lined with subtle signs of its importance. Security cameras are hidden in decorative moldings. Motion detectors are tucked into the corners of the ceiling. Doors open only with a combination of physical keys and biometric scans. For a work that is not officially acknowledged to exist, the effort to guard it is extraordinary. If the painting has truly been kept in this hidden gallery for generations, it has remained untouched by the outside world, shielded from light, moisture, and curious eyes. And perhaps that is exactly how the Vatican intends it to stay, perfectly preserved, endlessly guarded, and locked away where its secrets can survive without ever being revealed. From the moment the painting was completed, it seems to have passed into a chain of custody so carefully managed that its very existence faded from public memory. Unlike works displayed in basilicas or chapels, where generations of worshippers could admire them, this one was moved almost immediately into private hands, the hands of those who understood that some images were never meant for the eyes of the masses. Historians who have pieced together fragments of correspondence suggest that the first to take possession was a pope whose reign began in the early 1600s. He is said to have kept the painting in a private study, accessible only to a few trusted cardinals. These men were not merely caretakers. They were guardians of something that, if seen by the wrong audience, could provoke dangerous questions about scripture, history, and the nature of divine authority. Over the years, each new custodian inherited both the painting and the responsibility to keep it hidden. This was not done through public decrees or official records, but through quiet, face-to-face conversations held behind closed doors. A retiring pope might summon his successor to the apostolic palace, lead him down into the restricted archives, and reveal the painting in the dim light of a lantern. Alongside the artwork came whispered warnings about the consequences of letting it be known. Some popes reportedly found the painting unsettling, even disturbing. A few are believed to have considered destroying it entirely, fearing its imagery could be weaponized by critics of the Church. Yet, each time, a cardinal or archivist convinced them otherwise, arguing that it was too valuable as a piece of history to erase. So it survived, slipping quietly from one generation's care to the next. Cardinals tasked with overseeing the Vatican's secret collections played their part as well. They maintained coded inventories that masked the painting's identity, describing it in vague terms that could apply to dozens of other works. It was always filed under an innocuous title, never photographed, never loaned, and never moved except under the most secure conditions. Couriers who transported it between storage locations were drawn from the Vatican's most loyal staff, each sworn to secrecy under pain of excommunication. Even in times of political upheaval, when invading armies threatened Rome, when the Papal States dissolved, when the Second World War loomed, the painting was protected. It was relocated to hidden vaults, sometimes beneath monasteries, sometimes in fortified rooms below churches whose existence was known only to a handful of men. Every move was planned in advance, every transfer done quietly enough that not even the Vatican's closest allies would suspect. Through centuries of change, the chain of custody has never broken. Popes have died, cardinals have fallen from power, wars have redrawn maps, yet the painting remains exactly where its keepers have chosen it to be, unseen. The tradition is as unshakable as any dogma, and those entrusted with it understand that they are part of something larger than themselves, a silent agreement across time to guard a secret that the world is not ready to face. If the painting has been so carefully hidden for centuries, it is not because everyone who encountered it wished to protect it. There are records, fragmented, coded, and often buried within unrelated documents, that suggest more than one attempt was made to destroy it entirely. Each time, the effort failed, leaving the work intact and deepening its aura of invincibility. One of the earliest known attempts dates back to the mid-1700s. A fire broke out in a section of the Apostolic Palace, where rare manuscripts and artworks were stored. Officially, the cause was a faulty lamp, but some scholars believe it was deliberately set to eliminate certain troublesome pieces from the archives. Among the items on the list was a canvas of unknown authorship, depicting figures of doubtful orthodoxy. When the smoke cleared, nearly everything in that section had been reduced to ash except for the painting, which had somehow been removed the day before, under the orders of an unnamed cardinal. In the early 1800s, during a wave of political upheaval, the Vatican initiated a quiet purge of artifacts considered incompatible with the strengthening of the faith. This purge included works of art, early manuscripts, and theological treatises that contradicted official doctrine. The painting was reportedly placed on a list for destruction, yet before the order could be carried out, it was transferred to a different location under the pretext of a conservation review. The reviewer's name appears nowhere in surviving records, leading some to suspect that the move was arranged by someone high in the church hierarchy who wished to save it. The Second World War brought another close call. As the Axis powers tightened their grip on Europe, Rome became a target for bombings and looting. Some Vatican officials feared that occupying forces might seize the secret archives and expose or destroy their most sensitive holdings. According to a diary kept by a Monsignor at the time, the painting was prepared for destruction in case evacuation was impossible. Yet when the moment came, the order was never given. Instead, it was smuggled into a hidden vault beneath a monastery in the Apennine Mountains, where it remained until the war ended. Even in more recent decades, there have been what insiders call accidents: leaks in climate control systems, unexpected floods, mysterious electrical faults. Each time, the damage stopped just short of where the painting was stored. Whether by quick action, luck, or something else entirely, it survived untouched. For those who see the painting as dangerous, its persistence is frustrating, almost uncanny. For those who believe it holds truths worth preserving, every failed attempt to erase it feels like proof that it is meant to endure. Whatever force protects it, human loyalty, sheer coincidence, or something beyond explanation, it has ensured that the painting remains exactly where it has always been, just out of reach, hidden yet impossible to erase from history. He had been retired for more than a decade when he finally spoke of it. A man in his late 80s, soft-spoken and careful with his words, the former archivist had spent nearly 40 years in the Vatican's most restricted rooms. His career had been one of quiet, meticulous work, cataloguing, preserving, and managing artifacts that most people would never know existed. When asked why he decided to talk, he said it was not to expose the church, but because he feared that without a record, certain truths would vanish entirely. He began by explaining how the Vatican's official art inventory was only part of the picture. The public lists, the ones scholars and historians could request, contained only approved works. Behind that was a second system, known only to a small group of archivists and cardinals. This was where the truly sensitive items were recorded, but even there, nothing was ever described plainly. Instead, each piece was given a coded name, an invented provenance, and a vague physical description that could apply to dozens of other objects. The archivist claimed that the painting was one of the most carefully disguised entries in this hidden log. It never appeared under its real subject or artist. Instead, it was filed as Inventory number 414, Devotional Scene, Unknown Hand, Mid-Period. The phrase mid-period was meaningless outside the archive, but among those who knew, it referred to works of uncertain or intentionally obscured dating. He admitted that even he did not know the artist's true name, though whispers among his colleagues suggested it was someone who had once worked for the Vatican but had fallen out of favour. Over the years, he began to notice that the painting's location in the log changed often, far more than any other piece. One year it would be recorded as stored in a numbered room in the Apostolic Palace, the next year in a vault beneath a basilica. The moves were always justified with vague notes like climate stabilization or inventory rotation, but he suspected the true reason was to prevent too many people from knowing where it was at any given time. The most intriguing part of his confession was his discovery of marginalia, faint pencil marks in the corners of certain log pages. These marks, he said, were left by archivists over generations, a quiet tradition among those who guarded the peace. They were not random scribbles, but small geometric shapes, stars, and even constellation patterns, echoing the imagery said to appear in the painting itself. He believed these marks were a silent acknowledgement of the work's importance, a way for its custodians to recognize each other without ever writing its true name. When asked if he had ever seen the painting in person, he paused for a long moment before answering. Yes, he said, once, decades ago, during a controlled viewing for new custodians. He would not describe it in detail, but his voice softened when he said it was unlike anything else in the collection. It is not simply a painting, he murmured. It is a message, and messages like that are never meant for everyone. The man who took the photograph was never meant to be in that room. According to those who knew him, he was a contractor hired for a short-term restoration project somewhere deep within the Vatican's walls. His work was supposed to keep him in the public access areas, but a misplaced set of keys and a moment of curiosity led him into a corridor he later described to a friend as too quiet for its own good. That was where he saw it, the painting that would later send ripples through the hidden corners of the art world. He claimed the door to the storage chamber was ajar, with no guards in sight. Inside, under the soft glow of carefully filtered lights, stood the work itself, framed and encased in glass. He had his camera with him, as he always did, and without thinking about the consequences, he took a single shot. No flash, no noise, just a quiet click that would change everything. Within days, the image appeared online, posted anonymously, and quickly shared among obscure forums dedicated to lost art and Vatican mysteries. The photograph was grainy, but clear enough to make out the strange symbols, the cloaked figure, and the night sky frozen in that impossible arrangement of stars. It was unlike anything most viewers had ever seen, and its mystery only grew as the Vatican made no comment. Then, just weeks later, the man was gone. His neighbours recalled seeing him leave his apartment one morning with a small suitcase, telling someone on the phone that he had been offered a new job abroad. That was the last confirmed sighting. He missed rent payments. His phone went silent. Friends and family filed missing person reports, but no trace was ever found. His bank accounts remained untouched, his passport never used. Rumours spread quickly. Some believed he had been threatened into disappearing, given a choice between vanishing quietly or facing something worse. Others thought he had been offered a large sum of money to walk away from his life and never speak of what he saw. A few suspected foul play, pointing to the fact that no official investigation seemed to go anywhere, as if someone had decided not to look too hard. The most unsettling theory came from a fellow contractor who had worked alongside him. This man claimed that in the weeks before his disappearance, the photographer had become paranoid, convinced he was being followed. He avoided the same streets twice in a day, never used the same cafe more than once, and began leaving his phone behind during errands. On one occasion, he reportedly told his friend, "They're not angry about the photo, they're angry about what I might have seen in it." To this day, no one knows for sure what happened to him. The photograph remains, circulating quietly in hidden corners of the internet, but the man behind the camera has slipped into the same kind of shadow that surrounds the painting itself, an absence filled only with questions, and the uneasy feeling that someone, somewhere, wanted it that way. The story came from a nurse who had worked in the Vatican's private medical wing for over 20 years. She had seen popes, bishops, and cardinals in their final moments, each passing with the weight of a lifetime of secrets. But none had unsettled her more than the words spoken by Cardinal Silvano Ricci during the last hours of his life in the winter of 2003. Ricci had been a powerful figure within the Curia for decades, known for his razor-sharp intellect and his absolute loyalty to the Church. In public, he was stern but respected, the kind of man who never betrayed even a flicker of doubt. Yet in those last hours, with the shadows of the night pressing against the windows and the quiet hum of medical machines filling the room, the mask seemed to slip. The nurse recalled that he grew restless, asking for the lights to be dimmed and the doors closed. He insisted on speaking to her alone, refusing the presence of priests or fellow cardinals. His voice was weak, but his eyes, she said, were burning with something that was not fear but urgency. He told her he needed to leave one truth behind, even if she never understood it. In halting breaths, he spoke of a painting locked away beneath the apostolic palace, a work older than anyone realized, and far more dangerous than the world could accept. He claimed that it was not simply art, but a memory made visible, a record of an event from the earliest days of human history, one that the Church had sworn to erase. He said the painting shows the one thing we were never meant to remember, though he never explained exactly what that meant. When the nurse pressed him, he grew agitated, muttering about the figure in the centre and the ones around it who were not angels, not saints, but something else entirely. He described symbols hidden in the folds of the robes and in the sky above, symbols that pointed to a truth older than Scripture and too vast for the Church to control. Every pope who had seen it, he claimed, had sworn to keep it hidden, fearing that if humanity remembered this thing, whatever it was, the entire foundation of organized religion might crumble. His final words about it were almost a plea. "Do not seek it," he told her. "You think you want to know, but once you do, you can never unknow, and that knowledge will not set you free." Moments later, his breathing slowed, and the room fell silent except for the machines. The nurse never forgot those words. She spoke of them only once, years later, to a journalist who had been investigating the rumours surrounding the leaked image. Whether Ricci's warning was the rambling of a man near death, or the last desperate truth of someone who had spent his life guarding a terrible secret, remains unknown. But for those who have heard it, the phrase still lingers in the air, unsettling, unfinished, and heavy with meaning. When scientists first gained access to microscopic pigment samples from the painting, they expected to confirm what most art historians already assumed, that it was created using the same materials found in countless other European works of its era. Instead, the analysis yielded results that did not just surprise them, it shook the timeline of global history. Under high-powered magnification, the pigments revealed a palette far stranger than anticipated. Yes, there were familiar colours made from ochres, lead white, and lapis lazuli. But woven among them were traces of materials that should have been impossible for the time period in which the painting was supposedly created. The most striking was a deep, vivid red, identified as cochineal, a dye made from insects found only in the Americas. Officially, this pigment did not arrive in Europe until decades after the earliest possible date of the painting. Its presence suggested that someone had access to transoceanic trade routes far earlier than recorded history admits. Even more startling was the discovery of a particular blue-green pigment derived from a rare copper-based mineral sourced in regions of Southeast Asia. There is no record of this material appearing in any European art of the era, and transporting it would have required trade networks spanning half the globe. Forensic cross-referencing confirmed the source with near certainty, leaving researchers with the uncomfortable question of how such a substance could have found its way into the Vatican's possession long before those routes were supposedly open. The implications went far beyond art history. If the pigments were authentic to the original work, and all evidence suggested they were, then either global exploration and trade occurred much earlier than acknowledged, or the artist had access to materials from civilizations that official history claims had no contact with Europe at the time. In either case, the painting stood as physical proof that the story of human connection across continents was far older and more complex than textbooks would have us believe. Privately, some researchers suspected the Vatican had long known about the pigment origins. After all, to store the painting so carefully for so many centuries suggested it held more than just artistic value. Its very materials were a record of a forgotten global network, one that would force historians to rewrite entire chapters of economic and cultural development. Publicly acknowledging such evidence would challenge entrenched narratives about who discovered what and when, and would erode the Eurocentric framing of world history that had persisted for centuries. Those who examined the findings were quietly advised not to speak of them outside of professional circles. One scientist later admitted that shortly after the results were compiled, a Vatican representative visited the lab, reviewed the documentation, and left with the original pigment samples. Only digital scans and private notes remain, and those are kept by people who know that revealing them might bring more trouble than recognition. What began as a simple pigment test had turned into something much bigger, a glimpse into a chapter of human history that was deliberately erased, hidden not just in archives, but in the very colours of a forbidden painting. The request for carbon dating came quietly, tucked into a routine conservation review, as if no one wanted to draw attention to it. Small fibres from the painting's original canvas backing were taken under the strictest conditions, each fragment sealed in sterile containers and labelled in a code that only 2 people could read. The test was meant to settle a long-standing debate among the few scholars who even knew the work existed. Exactly when was it created? Most expected the results to align with the official assumptions that the painting was a product of the late Renaissance, perhaps the early 1700s at the latest. But when the analysis came back, the numbers told a different story. The carbon dating placed the fiber's origin several centuries earlier, somewhere between the late 1000s and the early 1200s. That meant the painting could predate not just the Renaissance, but even the Gothic period of European art. This finding made no sense to anyone who had studied its style. The brushwork, the composition, and the use of perspective were all hallmarks of a much later era. Yet the dating was precise, verified by multiple labs using independent samples. The only way to reconcile the results was to accept one of 2 possibilities. Either the canvas itself had been repurposed from a much older work, or the painting was far older than any known example of its style. If the latter were true, it would mean the artist was centuries ahead of their time, using techniques and materials that should not have existed for hundreds of years. It would also mean the Vatican had in its possession a piece of art that could rewrite the entire timeline of European painting. Publicly admitting this would undermine countless academic frameworks and force a re-examination of when, and perhaps how, certain artistic breakthroughs occurred. Privately, some conservation experts whispered about a third possibility, one they knew better than to raise in official reports. What if the painting was not from Europe at all, but from a civilization whose history had been erased or absorbed into later traditions? What if the reason it felt out of place was because it was never meant to fit into the accepted timeline? The Vatican's response to the dating results was swift and final. The physical samples were removed from the labs and returned to an undisclosed location. All official reports were marked as restricted, with no copies allowed to circulate outside the archives. Those who had handled the material were asked to sign new confidentiality agreements, some under the implied threat of losing their positions or funding. Within weeks, the subject was quietly dropped from internal discussions. The painting's official record remained unchanged, still dated to the period the Vatican had always claimed. Yet for the handful of people who had seen the numbers with their own eyes, the truth lingered like an unanswered question, one that made the air around the painting feel heavier, older, and far stranger than anyone had dared to imagine. The decision to run an infrared scan was made quietly, almost as an afterthought during a scheduled conservation check. The painting had always been kept in such controlled conditions that its surface was pristine. showing none of the usual signs of deterioration that often prompt deeper imaging. But the conservators were curious, and curiosity in the Vatican's restricted archives can be a dangerous thing. Infrared reflectography is a powerful tool. It can look past centuries of varnish and paint, revealing the earliest strokes and even discarded designs buried beneath the surface. In this case, the scan began innocently enough, showing the expected underdrawing, faint lines mapping out the placement of figures, folds of fabric, and background scenery. Then, as the imaging deepened, the familiar scene began to fade away, replaced by something no one in the room was prepared to see. Beneath the visible painting was an entirely different image. It was not a preliminary sketch or a rough draft, but a fully realized composition, darker in tone and entirely alien in subject. Instead of the cloaked figure and celestial sky known from the surface layer, the underpainting depicted a massive structure that seemed to combine elements of a ziggurat, a pyramid, and an altar. Around it stood tall, elongated beings with eyes that seemed too large and too knowing, their hands raised in what might have been greeting or warning. The sky above this hidden scene was not the deep blue of the surface image, but a turbulent, reddish hue, streaked with what looked like glowing arcs. It gave the impression of a world either being born or collapsing. Strange geometric symbols were scattered across the structure's walls, some of which matched markings found in ancient sites thousands of miles apart and thousands of years older than the painting's supposed date. What stunned the team most was the detail. Every figure, every stone block of the mysterious structure was painted with the same mastery as the visible work. This was not something hastily covered over. It was deliberate, layered with precision, so the second image would be hidden, yet preserved perfectly beneath. Theories among the few who saw the scans varied wildly. Some believed the artist had been ordered to paint over the original for fear of what it portrayed. Others thought the hidden image was the true painting, with the outer layer acting as a kind of camouflage to keep it safe from destruction. There were even whispers that the surface image might have been added decades, or even centuries, later by another hand entirely. The Vatican archivist, overseeing the session, ended it abruptly. The scans were saved to a secure drive, removed from the lab's network, and locked away with a warning not to discuss them further. Officially, the conservation report noted routine imaging with no unusual findings. Unofficially, those who witnessed the hidden image knew they had glimpsed something extraordinary, a message painted twice, once for the world above, and once for a world hidden in the shadows. It began with the stars. Not the stars painted in broad strokes to suggest a generic night sky, but the precise, almost obsessive rendering of each constellation. Astronomers who examined high-resolution images of the painting realized quickly that this was not an imagined arrangement. It was an exact match for the sky, as it would have appeared from the Mediterranean region on a very specific night, and that night, according to modern astronomical software, occurred more than 2,000 years ago. This discovery set off a quiet storm among the handful of people who knew. The constellations matched a date centuries earlier than the official biblical timeline would allow for the events the painting seemed to depict. If the artist had captured that moment intentionally, it meant either they had access to astronomical knowledge far beyond their time, or the scene itself was a record of something that actually happened on that ancient date. The most troubling part for church historians was that the date corresponded closely with alternative chronologies proposed by fringe researchers, theories that place key biblical events, including the birth of certain patriarchs and the migrations of early peoples, hundreds of years earlier than traditional accounts. Accepting the star map's date would mean admitting that some parts of the official sacred timeline might be wrong, or at least incomplete. One scholar, speaking off the record, explained it in stark terms. If the sky in that painting is accurate, he said, then entire sections of biblical history have to be shifted. It changes not just the dating of events, but the context in which they happened. It moves them into a world that looked very different politically, culturally, and spiritually. There was another layer to the problem. The precise alignment of the planets on that date suggested it coincided with a rare astronomical conjunction, something that ancient civilizations often interpreted as a divine sign. If the artist had intended to connect the biblical event to such a celestial moment, it implied a blending of scripture with older, perhaps pagan, systems of prophecy and meaning that would be heresy to the strictest interpreters of church doctrine. The Vatican's reaction was predictable. Access to the high-resolution images was revoked. The astronomers were thanked politely for their time and told their services would not be needed further. One was even approached with an offer to work on a completely different project, far from anything related to religious history. The official catalogue entry for the painting makes no mention of astronomical accuracy, referring only to a stylized celestial backdrop. Still, the data exists. Somewhere in a locked folder are the overlays showing the perfect match between paint and sky, the coordinates and the date etched in the heavens long before the brush ever touched canvas. For those who have seen it, the effect is unsettling. It is as if the painting is not merely a work of art, but a clock, one set to a time the world has forgotten, counting down to a truth the Church has spent centuries trying to keep in the dark. It was a detail almost no one noticed at first. Hidden in the lower border of the painting, worked into the elaborate filigree of vines and gilded script, were a series of small circular medallions. Each medallion bore a likeness, some clearly identifiable as past popes, others less distinct, their features worn or obscured by time. At first glance, it seemed like a decorative homage to the Church's long line of leadership. But under magnification, those medallions began to tell a story that did not match the official record. Several of the faces did not correspond to any known pope in the recognized lineage. Some bore unfamiliar coats of arms, symbols never documented in church heraldry. Even more curious, there were subtle visual cues linking certain figures, shared patterns in their robes, repeated background motifs, as if to suggest that some had ruled consecutively, yet their reigns were missing from history entirely. In a few cases, the medallions even overlapped or seemed deliberately altered, as though one face had been painted over another. When historians compared the sequence of these medallions to the official papal list, they found gaps where the art implied additional rulers might have existed. These gaps coincided eerily with periods of political instability in medieval Europe, times when records were sparse, wars raged, and control over the papacy was fiercely contested. Some researchers privately speculated that the missing figures could have been anti-popes whose reigns were later erased, or legitimate popes whose existence was suppressed to maintain a cleaner, more controlled historical narrative. The idea that sections of papal succession might have been fabricated or rewritten is not entirely new. Scholars outside the Church have long debated whether certain names on the official list were inserted to cover up vacancies or contested reigns. What made the painting so dangerous was that it seemed to encode this accusation visually, as if the artist had been documenting a hidden truth for those sharp enough to see it. The Vatican's internal reaction to this discovery was swift. Access to high-resolution scans of the border was restricted, and reproductions of the painting in official publications began to crop the frame so the medallions were no longer visible. In private correspondence, certain archivists were instructed not to entertain speculative interpretations of decorative elements, framing them instead as purely symbolic embellishments. Yet among those who had studied the work closely, the implications lingered. If the painting was correct, it suggested that the Church's leadership lineage, the very chain of authority connecting the modern papacy to St. Peter, might not be as unbroken as claimed. For an institution that bases its legitimacy on an unbroken line of succession, such a revelation would be catastrophic. Whether the medallions were an act of defiance by the artist, a coded record for future generations, or simply an elaborate coincidence remains a matter of debate. But for anyone who has looked closely, the impression is unavoidable. The painting does not just challenge theological history, it quietly dares to rewrite the power structure of the Church itself. The breakthrough came when an art historian in Paris, unaware of the Vatican painting's full story, stumbled across a peculiar connection. While cataloguing rarely seen works in the Louvre's archives, she found a large religious canvas that had never been on public display. It was officially attributed to an anonymous 15th century artist, but something about the brushwork caught her attention. The strokes were deliberate yet fluid, and the way light fell across the figures felt hauntingly familiar. After weeks of studying the Louvre piece, she realized why it stood out. The technique, the color palette, and even the subtle use of geometric understructures in the composition matched perfectly with the leaked images of the Vatican's hidden painting she had seen years earlier in academic whispers. The similarities were too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Word of her discovery spread quietly through a small network of researchers, leading others to check their own museum archives. At the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, curators uncovered a painting in deep storage that bore the same distinctive qualities: an almost supernatural rendering of eyes, a background sky filled with strange constellations, and a layering of pigments that shifted in tone depending on the angle of the light. The deeper they looked, the more examples appeared, though always hidden from public view. A privately held triptych in a Swiss collection, known only to a handful of collectors, displayed identical brush patterns along the drapery folds. A fragmentary panel painting locked in the basement of a Madrid museum contained a section of border filigree that matched the Vatican piece almost line for line. What tied them together was not just the style, but the recurring presence of symbols, geometric shapes, unfamiliar celestial arrangements, and figures that seemed to stand outside of conventional Christian iconography. In each case, these elements had been overlooked or dismissed in the official documentation, as if curators had chosen not to dwell on them. This growing network of connected works began to suggest something much larger. A hidden body of art scattered across continents, all possibly created by the same mysterious hand or by a small group of artists working with a shared purpose. The geographic spread of these pieces, from Rome to Paris, St. Petersburg to private vaults, hinted at a secret movement operating in parallel to the Church's sanctioned art. If that movement existed, it was astonishingly well hidden. No official records name such a group, and no clear patronage has been identified. Yet the similarities between these works make it nearly impossible to believe they are unrelated. For some historians, the idea that the Vatican painting might be just one chapter in a much larger, global visual narrative is both thrilling and dangerous. Thrilling because it could rewrite the understanding of art history. Dangerous because, if the hidden works all carry the same encrypted messages, their collective meaning could be something the Vatican, and perhaps other powers, have worked for centuries to suppress. The Louvre, the Hermitage, and the private collectors remain largely silent, keeping their treasures locked away. But for those who know the patterns, the sense is growing that somewhere, in the shadows of the art world, a bigger picture is waiting to be assembled. The pushback began suddenly, almost as if a switch had been flipped somewhere deep within the Vatican's communication apparatus. For months there had been nothing but silence, the kind of strategic quiet that leaves rumours to swirl unchecked. Then, without warning, the official line appeared in a series of carefully worded statements to select media outlets. The painting, the Vatican declared, was nothing more than a modern forgery, an elaborate fabrication designed to deceive. The language of the statements was measured, but the intent was unmistakable. They claimed that recent independent analysis had revealed inconsistencies in the pigments and canvas, supposedly proving that the work could not have been created earlier than the late 19th century. The same statements described the leaked image as a digital manipulation designed to resemble a priceless relic, asserting that it had been maliciously misrepresented to fuel conspiracy theories. For anyone unfamiliar with the deeper story, the narrative was convincing. The Vatican positioned itself as the victim of a hoax, a guardian of truth forced to protect the public from dangerous fabrications. But for those who had seen the pigment tests, the carbon dating results, and the infrared scans with their hidden underpainting, the official explanation was laughably thin. The contradictions were glaring. The supposed modern pigments had already been proven to match materials from centuries earlier, and the canvas fibres had been dated to the high medieval period. The counterattack went beyond words. Journalists who had expressed interest in covering the story suddenly found their sources drying up. Academics who had been willing to speak off the record stopped answering emails, some hinting at threats to their careers if they continued to pursue the topic. Even digital copies of the leaked image began disappearing from online forums, replaced by doctored versions that looked amateurish, bolstering the claim of forgery. There was also an unmistakable smear campaign against the man who had originally leaked the photo, painting him as a troubled opportunist who had fabricated the image for attention. Conveniently, the Vatican never addressed the fact that he had vanished entirely, his disappearance still unexplained. The shift in public perception was subtle but effective. Those who still believed the painting was real were increasingly framed as fringe theorists clinging to a fantasy. Yet the very force of the Vatican's denials had the opposite effect on some observers. Why, they wondered, would such an institution devote so much effort to dismissing something it claimed was irrelevant? If the painting truly was a forgery, why not simply produce the evidence and let the matter fade away naturally? Instead, the aggressive push to rewrite the narrative only deepened suspicions. In trying to erase the painting from legitimacy, the Vatican had unwittingly given it more power. The story was no longer just about a mysterious work of art. It had become a test of truth itself, a battle between the official record and the fragments of evidence that refused to disappear. And in that battle, every denial sounded less like certainty and more like fear. It started in quiet corners of academic conferences, in whispered conversations over coffee, where no one dared speak too loudly. A small group of historians, art conservators, and scientists had all seen different pieces of the puzzle. One had run the pigment analysis that revealed colours from continents supposedly unknown to Europe at the time. Another had been part of the carbon dating team that placed the canvas centuries earlier than the official record allowed. A third had personally examined the infrared scans that revealed the hidden underpainting. Each of them had been silenced in one way or another, their access revoked, their careers threatened. For months, they worked in isolation, afraid to risk more. But as the Vatican's official denials grew louder and more pointed, something shifted. The scholars began to find each other, reaching out through encrypted channels and trusted intermediaries. What they discovered was both empowering and dangerous. Together, they had enough evidence to challenge the Vatican's narrative outright. The decision to go public was not made lightly. Every one of them knew the risks. Publishing their findings would mean open conflict with one of the most powerful institutions on Earth. It could mean the loss of grants, research positions, even the destruction of reputations built over decades. But the alternative, staying silent while the truth was buried, felt like complicity. They formed an informal coalition, pooling their data and expertise. The result was a massive, meticulously sourced document detailing the painting's history, the scientific tests, and the suppressed connections to other hidden artworks around the world. They included images, lab reports, and cross-references to public archives, ensuring that even if parts of their work were removed or discredited, enough would survive to keep the questions alive. When they finally published, it was not through traditional academic journals, which they knew would be pressured into rejection. Instead, they released their findings online through decentralized networks mirrored on servers in multiple countries. Within hours, the document began spreading across social media, art history forums, and independent news outlets. The Vatican moved quickly to discredit them, calling the work amateur speculation and accusing the authors of misrepresenting data. Several of the scholars lost their positions almost immediately. One received a formal letter from their university stating that their actions had brought disrepute to the institution. Another had funding for unrelated research projects abruptly withdrawn. Yet despite the backlash, the damage to the official narrative had been done. The evidence was out in the open, impossible to fully erase. And for every door that closed to the scholars professionally, a new one opened in the form of public support. Independent journalists sought interviews, private collectors offered access to their archives, and thousands of ordinary people became invested in uncovering the truth. The scholars had not just defended their findings, they had lit a signal fire, one that burned brightly in the dark corners where the Vatican's influence could not reach, attracting others who had pieces of the same long-buried story. It began as a single post on a small art history forum, buried among threads about Renaissance techniques and museum restoration projects. A user with an unremarkable screen name uploaded what they claimed were high-resolution scans of the Vatican's forbidden painting. At first, almost no one noticed. The thread gathered a handful of comments, mostly from skeptics questioning the authenticity. But within hours, the images were being shared on private Discord servers, encrypted group chats, and obscure corners of the internet where digital takedowns rarely succeed. The quality of the images was breathtaking. Every detail of the brushwork, every fine crack in the paint surface, every hidden symbol in the borders was visible with perfect clarity. Viewers could zoom in to see the reflection in a character's eye or the faint trace of an earlier sketch beneath the final layer of paint. The hidden constellations in the sky, the strange geometric designs embedded in the architecture, even the mysterious medallions along the lower border were all there, undeniable and unedited. By the next morning, the images had jumped from private forums to public platforms. They appeared in Twitter threads, Reddit discussions, and Telegram channels. Art enthusiasts dissected the brush techniques, while amateur historians compared the hidden symbols to ancient manuscripts. Conspiracy theorists claimed the work proved their long-held suspicions about hidden Vatican knowledge. The Vatican's response was immediate and forceful. DMCA takedown requests began flooding social media companies, demanding the removal of the images. Accounts that refused to comply were suspended, and websites hosting the files found themselves targeted with legal threats. But it was too late. The internet had already done what it does best: replicate, fragment, and scatter the files across countless backups and mirrors. For every link taken down, 3 more appeared elsewhere. What startled many observers was how quickly the general public began to take interest. This was no longer a niche conversation among academics and art historians. People with no background in religious history were now poring over the images, debating the meaning of strange details, and speculating about why such a painting would be hidden for centuries. YouTube channels, TikTok accounts, and Instagram pages sprang up dedicated entirely to analysing the leaked images, each gaining tens of thousands of followers in days. For some, the painting was a work of mysterious beauty that transcended the controversy. For others, it was proof of deliberate suppression. Either way, the Vatican found itself facing something it could not control: a global audience studying, sharing, and interpreting the image without its permission. By the end of the week, the painting had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a secret object locked in the Vatican's archives. It had become a shared cultural artifact, living in the devices and imaginations of millions. And with every new theory, every zoomed-in screenshot, every viral post, the question only grew louder. If the Vatican had nothing to hide, why had it fought so hard to keep this painting from the world? It was an amateur restorer in Buenos Aires who first spotted it. He had downloaded one of the leaked high-resolution images and was examining it under different digital filters out of pure curiosity. While enhancing the contrast around the folds of a dark robe in the lower left corner, he noticed a faint, almost imperceptible line of text. At first it looked like nothing more than a crack in the paint, but the uniform spacing suggested otherwise. Intrigued, he adjusted the image further, increasing the sharpness and inverting the colors. Slowly, the letters emerged, faint, thin, but unmistakably carved into the paint itself, as if scratched in with the tip of a fine brush or even a blade before the final varnish was applied. They were in Latin, the script elegantly curved but worn enough that several characters were barely legible. He posted his finding to a private art discussion group, and within hours, Latin scholars around the world were debating its meaning. After much back and forth over the faded characters, the consensus reading emerged: Quod deletas rediturum est. Translated, it meant, what was erased shall return. The phrase sent ripples through the small community, already obsessed with the painting. To some, it felt like a direct challenge to the Vatican's centuries of secrecy. Was the artist predicting that whatever the Church had tried to hide, whether in history, scripture, or memory, would eventually be revealed? Others believed the message was more personal, perhaps a defiant signature left by the painter after being forced to alter the work, as if promising to future generations that the truth would outlive the censors. What made the inscription even more intriguing was its placement. It was not prominently displayed, or even in a logical location for a symbolic message. Instead, it was tucked away in shadow, nearly invisible to the naked eye. Someone could easily have examined the painting in person for years and never noticed it. This suggested it was meant for a very specific audience, not for the patrons or the church officials, but for someone centuries in the future, armed with the tools to uncover it. Once the discovery went public, digital archaeologists began scouring the rest of the painting for similar hidden text. Small, suspicious marks in the margins were scrutinized pixel by pixel, but none yielded anything as clear as the Latin phrase. The single sentence stood alone, like a whisper preserved in pigment. The Vatican, unsurprisingly, refused to comment on the inscription. In fact, official statements dismissed it entirely, claiming it was nothing more than random brush texture misinterpreted by overzealous internet users. But that explanation rang hollow for anyone who had seen the crispness of the letters under digital magnification. The phrase quickly became a rallying cry among those following the mystery. What was erased shall return appeared in forum signatures, on t-shirts, even graffitied on walls in cities across Europe. For many, it wasn't just about a painting anymore. It was about the idea that no matter how deep you bury the truth, it will eventually claw its way back into the light. It was a theory whispered on the edges of the conversation for months, dismissed at first as wild speculation, but as more experts dissected the leaked high-resolution images, the idea began to solidify into something harder to ignore. The figures in the painting, long assumed to be biblical or at least Christian in origin, did not match any known scriptural scene. Their clothing, their postures, even the objects they held seemed wrong for any passage in the Old or New Testament. At the center of the composition was the cloaked figure bearing papal insignia, surrounded not by saints or apostles, but by a gathering of beings whose forms defied easy classification. Some appeared human, though dressed in robes and armor styles alien to medieval Europe. Others were humanoid but subtly wrong, too tall, with elongated skulls, unnervingly symmetrical features, or eyes painted with an intensity that made them seem almost alive. One figure's hands were visible, each with 6 long, jointed fingers tipped in metallic-looking nails. The arrangement of the group suggested deliberation, not worship. They were seated or standing around a low, circular table carved with intricate geometric designs. It looked less like a religious scene and more like a formal meeting, a council convened for a matter of grave importance. The background offered further clues. The architecture was an impossible blend of styles: towering columns reminiscent of ancient Egypt, archways similar to Sumerian reliefs, and distant domes, with designs found in pre-Columbian temples. No single time or place could contain them all, yet here they were, coexisting in a single vision. The most telling detail lay in the hands of one of the non-human figures. It held a scroll, partially unrolled, upon which faint symbols could be seen. Linguists examining the images claimed the writing did not match any known language, but bore similarities to ancient scripts from multiple continents, as if someone had merged them into a single universal code. When compared to historical records of ancient councils, both real and mythical, the painting seemed to echo stories from cultures around the world. The Norse spoke of assemblies of gods deciding the fate of mankind. The Dogon people of Mali had tales of visitors from the stars meeting with human leaders. Even fragments of lost Gnostic texts hinted at gatherings where divine and mortal beings negotiated over knowledge and power. If the artist had intended to capture such an event, the implications were staggering. This would mean the painting was not a religious work meant to glorify Christian doctrine, but a visual record of something the Church would never admit, a moment in deep history when humanity was not alone at the table. The Vatican's fierce suppression of the painting suddenly made more sense to those entertaining this theory. A council of human and non-human figures discussing something too important to be left in the open could undermine the very foundations of religious authority. If this was the true subject of the painting, then the real threat was not artistic heresy. It was the possibility that the story of human history, as we know it, had been rewritten to hide who else might have been here with us. The letters were discovered in the most unexpected place, tucked inside the false bottom of a 17th century writing desk sold at a small auction in Florence. The desk had belonged to a minor noble family with distant ties to the papal court, and the bundle of aged parchment inside was brittle, the ink faded but still legible. Written in a flowing but uneven hand, the letters were addressed to no one by name, as if the writer feared identifying his intended reader. Yet their content left little doubt. These were the words of the mysterious artist behind the Vatican's most controversial painting. In the earliest letters, the tone was almost hopeful. The artist spoke of a commission unlike any he had ever received, one that required secrecy and absolute obedience. He described being brought to Rome under guard, escorted into a studio space he was forbidden to leave, and supplied with pigments and materials of extraordinary rarity. The work, he wrote, was not simply a painting but a message, encoded through symbols, geometry, and light. He hinted at instructors who guided his hand, some wearing the robes of church officials, others dressed in ways he could not place in any known tradition. As the months passed, the tone shifted. Later letters were filled with anxiety, describing a growing awareness that he was not free to leave, even once the work was completed. He wrote of strange visitors who came to examine the painting at night, speaking in languages he did not understand. One particularly chilling entry described the moment he was ordered to alter parts of the image, erasing certain figures and replacing them with others. "I obeyed," he wrote, "but I left marks that cannot be unseen by those who know where to look." The final letters were the most disturbing. The artist described being moved to a cell-like chamber beneath the apostolic palace, his brushes and pigments taken away. His meals were brought by silent attendants, and no one spoke to him unless to issue instructions. He believed he was to be released once questions of doctrine had been settled. But days turned to weeks, and his tone became increasingly desperate. The last letter ended abruptly, the final lines blotched with what might have been water stains or tears. It contained no farewell, only a cryptic sentence: "They fear the truth more than they fear God." No records exist of the artist's burial, and his name, if indeed he ever signed the work, is nowhere in official Vatican registries. Some researchers believe he died in confinement, his body quietly disposed of to erase any trace of his existence. Others think he may have been sent far from Rome under a false identity, forced to live out his final years in obscurity. The discovery of these letters did more than humanize the mystery. It transformed the painting from a mere artifact into the final testament of a man who paid the ultimate price for creating it. His brushstrokes were his voice, and through them he had spoken across centuries, leaving behind a truth his captors could not completely silence. The question that began as a niche curiosity among art historians had grown into something far bigger. With each new discovery about the painting, the forbidden symbols, the hidden constellations, the gathering of human and non-human figures, it became clearer that this was not just about an old artwork locked away in the Vatican's archives. This was about what it represented and why those in power had gone to such lengths to keep it hidden. If the painting truly depicted an ancient council where humans and other beings met as equals, it would challenge one of the most fundamental ideas in Christian doctrine: that humanity's spiritual history is solely defined by its relationship with God, as described in Scripture. The suggestion that other intelligences might have played a role in shaping human destiny, and that the Church knew about it, would unravel centuries of theological teaching. The symbols in the painting deepened this threat. Some were drawn from traditions predating Christianity by thousands of years. Others from cultures the Church once labelled as pagan or heretical. If these symbols were included intentionally, it could mean that early Christianity had absorbed far more from other belief systems than the official record admitted. That would mean the faith millions of people practice today was built on a foundation far more complex and far less pure than they had been told. The astronomical details painted into the background posed an even more dangerous implication. They pointed to a specific celestial alignment from over 2,000 years ago, a moment that, if taken literally, would force historians to reconsider biblical chronology itself. If the timelines shifted, so too would the sequence of events that the Church has used to anchor its authority for generations. This is why the painting matters now more than ever. In a world already filled with mistrust toward institutions, the sudden appearance of undeniable evidence that the Vatican has hidden something of this magnitude could cause a crisis of faith unlike anything in recent history. For some, it would confirm long-held suspicions that religious power is rooted in selective storytelling. For others, it would trigger confusion and despair, shaking the beliefs that form the core of their identity. The internet has only amplified the urgency. In earlier centuries, the Vatican could have quietly destroyed the painting and erased all mention of it. But now, high-resolution images exist in thousands of private devices, mirrored on servers beyond the reach of takedown notices. The more the Church tries to suppress it, the more people will want to know why. This is not simply an art mystery anymore. It is a fault line running beneath centuries of history, ready to crack open. If the truth behind the painting comes fully into the light, it will not just change how we see one hidden masterpiece. It could alter how we understand the entire story of humanity, its origins, and the forces, earthly or otherwise, that shaped it. And once that shift begins, there may be no turning back. In the months since the first leaked image appeared, the Vatican has issued only a handful of statements, none of which address the painting directly. They speak in generalities about misinformation and fabrications designed to mislead the faithful, but never once have they confirmed or denied that the painting exists. It is a strategy so deliberate that it feels almost ancient, the art of saying nothing, yet speaking volumes. By refusing to acknowledge the painting outright, the Vatican avoids giving legitimacy to the conversation. If they were to deny it, they would be forced to explain why such a detailed forgery exists, who created it, and why so many independent experts risk their careers to prove its authenticity. If they were to confirm it, they would invite a storm of questions that could lead directly to the cracks in centuries-old doctrine. So they choose the third path, the one they have perfected over hundreds of years: silence. But this silence is not empty. It is weighted with history, with the same method used during past controversies, from the suppression of certain ancient texts to the quiet removal of relics whose origins could not be reconciled with Scripture. The absence of an official position becomes a kind of control. Without a definitive answer, the Vatican leaves room for doubt, and doubt breeds division. It turns the debate into a battlefield where supporters and skeptics exhaust themselves fighting each other instead of demanding answers from the source. Inside the walls of the Apostolic Palace, this tactic has a practical advantage. By never speaking the painting's name, they ensure it remains officially invisible. In legal terms, it does not exist. In theological terms, it is irrelevant. This gives them the freedom to act behind the scenes, moving, hiding, or even altering the work, without public accountability. If confronted, they can simply say, "We never acknowledged such a thing." To the outside world, this silence feels like an admission in itself. People notice how quickly the Church responds to lesser scandals or works of art that truly are forgeries. They see the difference between the Vatican's loud condemnations of fake relics and their quiet evasion now. That contrast alone has become part of the story. And in an era where information travels faster than censorship, silence can be dangerous. The more the Vatican refuses to speak, the more space it leaves for the public to fill in the gaps with their own theories. Some imagine the painting confirms extraterrestrial contact. Others see it as proof of an ancient, unified religion, older than Christianity. Whatever the truth is, the lack of an answer gives every theory room to grow. The Vatican knows that time is on its side. They have weathered storms before, outlasting the voices of their critics, counting on public attention to fade. It is the same strategy they have used for centuries: speak little, wait long, and let the world move on. But this time, the question remains whether the world will move on, or whether the silence will only deepen the hunger to uncover what lies behind it. Beneath the marble floors and gilded halls of the Vatican, there are corridors most people will never see. Some are lined with archives, shelves groaning under the weight of manuscripts so old their pages crumble at the edges. Others lead to vault-like chambers where relics are locked away, each one catalogued in records the public will never read. And then there are the spaces spoken of only in whispers, the sealed rooms, the bricked-up doors, the narrow staircases descending into darkness. It is there, in the cold quiet beneath the Apostolic Palace, that the painting was kept for centuries. And it is there, many believe, that other works still wait, hidden from the world. If one painting could survive centuries of secrecy, who's to say there aren't others, perhaps even more dangerous to the narrative the Vatican has spent generations preserving? Hints surface now and then, small fragments that slip through the cracks. An archivist's offhand remark about rooms that haven't been opened in my lifetime. A workman's story of finding an iron gate deep underground, locked and marked with a symbol he didn't recognize. A tourist's blurry photograph showing an unmarked crate being wheeled into a side entrance of the Sistine Chapel after midnight. Individually, these stories might be dismissed. Together, they form a picture of a place still guarding more than it has revealed. Some researchers believe entire collections of forbidden art could be hidden below, works commissioned and then buried away, either because they contain truths too disruptive, or because they captured visions the Church could not explain. Imagine canvases depicting events from forgotten ages, sculptures modelled after beings the Bible never mentions, or maps charting lands that should not have been known at the time they were made. The idea sounds like something out of a novel, but so did the existence of the painting, until it emerged from the shadows. The Vatican, for its part, has no incentive to open those doors. The official line is that every artifact in its possession is carefully preserved and catalogued for scholarly purposes. But as the world has now seen, preserved can also mean hidden, and catalogued can mean buried where no one can find it. And yet, the discovery of the painting has changed something. The illusion that such secrets could remain safe forever has been broken. The internet has made it nearly impossible to erase something once it's been seen, and now there are thousands of eyes watching for the next leak. Perhaps the next revelation will come from another high-resolution image quietly posted online, or from a whistleblower willing to risk everything to let the truth out. Somewhere, under those ancient floors, there may be another door left, just slightly ajar. Not enough to see what lies beyond, but enough to remind us it's there, waiting. And when the moment comes, when whatever lies inside finally steps into the light, the world will once again be forced to ask itself how much of its history was told, and how much was carefully kept in the dark.